Hi everybody, welcome to our Google Plus Hangout. Hello, welcome to our Google Hangout with the Buck Institute for Education. I'm John Larmer, Editor-in-Chief here at BIE, and we're talking today about project-based learning and our gold standard model for PBL and one of our essential project design elements. More on that in a second, but a few logistics first. This will be a recorded Hangout. You can watch it later if you want to tell colleagues or check it out again and again. It'll be about a half-hour long. And if you have questions, you can ask them on the events page. I'll get to them, I'll relay them to our guests during the Hangout if they're on topic, and we might answer some offline later, but please do ask questions. And let me ask our guests to introduce themselves. Three of our esteemed national faculty, in order of, roughly in order of geographic distance. So, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Cackley, and I'm a social studies teacher at Ken Innovation High School in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a project-based learning high school.
All right, thanks, Mike. Kristen.
I'm Kristen Camps. I am also coming to you from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I am an elementary teacher, most recently, though, science and English in the middle school.
All right, thanks, Kristen. And Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Klein. I'm connecting from Denver, Colorado. I am no longer in the classroom, but I was a high school English teacher with a global focus for about 19 years, and now I just work with schools.
All right, thanks for joining us, guys. So we're talking today about student voice and choice in project-based learning. And that's one of our essential project design elements, which you can see there. And you can read more about that on our website. We have some blogs and articles about our model for gold standard PBL. It's also in a book I co-authored with John Mergendaler and Susie Boss called Setting the Standard for Project-Based Learning, published by ASCD. You can see that on our site too. Anyway, student voice and choice, as you can see, it's one of the 7 essential elements of a good project in gold standard PBL. So let's talk about that with our guests. So my first question basically is just what do we mean by student voice and choice, and why is it so important?
I think student voice and choice is giving students the opportunity to take control of their own learning. I think it's really important because to me it represents a shift from a teacher-centered classroom to student-centered. And this is where kids really get excited about learning when they get a say in what's happening in their learning.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Mike. One of the things that I found when my students were more engaged in the work through choices, that made sense. They were definitely more motivated to do the work. It moved them from passive to active learners.
Okay.
I agree totally, and I think for a lot of kids actually it's a make or break element. Those kids who tend to want to think for themselves, who would start to argue with the teacher, frankly, if they didn't have some room to make some of their own choices. But from the global education perspective also, I think that voice and choice from within the world of global education also indicates what I would describe as a 21st century imperative, that if we really want to see new solutions to the world's pressing problems, we have to do that through a student-centered model. If they're not getting a chance to really explore what matters to them and figure out what they think the potential solutions are, then we're not going to create the crop of new leaders who really can solve those challenges.
All right, great point. Yeah, Jennifer, that's true. I think it does create that sense of empowerment, and it'll create the leaders we need for the future. That's a great reason for voice and choice. I hadn't actually thought of it quite that way, but you're very correct there. And Mike, you mentioned the motivational issue. It's what gives students buy into the project. And yeah, I think as you said, I think it was Jennifer, it's a make or break element in a lot of ways. You can have all the other features of a good project, but if students feel like it's the teacher's project, they're being led through it, they're just completing a recipe for doing a product or something, they're not going to buy in because it's not going to have anywhere near the power. So I like that idea of it being a make or break element.
I would say that's really true in middle school. If you think about the nature of the middle school student,
yeah,
they're not quite to high school. 7th and 8th graders know very well that in their mind what they're doing doesn't really matter because it doesn't count. Is the way that they'll talk about it. But they're also at that age where they feel like they know enough to be able to contribute, and if they're not allowed that chance, they can shut down extremely quickly.
We need to quit doing school to kids and actually make it about learning. So give them a chance to do what they want to do and what they care about and tie it into their motivation. And sometimes we limit kids with our examples and our what we want from them, and when we give them voice and choice, they actually will blow us away and raise expectations and do things we never dreamed they'd even think of.
All right. So let's talk about some best practices for increasing student voice and choice in project-based learning. And if you want to lead into some examples of projects to illustrate that, feel free. So best practices for student voice and choice.
One of the things that when you ask that question, John, what comes to mind is something that comes up in the book that you wrote, and that is trying to match the choice and the amount of voice and choice that students are given to what would be actually happening in the world. Too often I see teachers who think about voice and choice meaning any kind of voice and any kind of choice in any part of the project without really considering the world outside of school. I don't have unlimited voice and choice in the things that I do. And so to really be intentional about setting those parameters as they would exist in the real world. For middle school kids, they like to be able to choose their groups, but that's not always what happens when you're working in the world outside of school. Or for them to have the choice to create whatever they want. Well, often that's not the case. So for teachers to really be thinking about why am I offering these choices? Why am I offering this amount of voice in this context? And what do I hope students are going to gain from that? I think is at least a starting point.
Yeah, that's a good point. The idea of constraints, I think, is a real world thing that students should need to pay attention to, because, yeah, so if you're given, you're creating a 5-minute video, it's not going to be 10 minutes, not going to be 3 minutes, it's 5 minutes. That's how things often are in the real world. It has to be very exact timing, certain parameters are put around a product, certain standards are used for it, and so voice and choice, but within constraints sometimes, is definitely real world.
I like to use the example of an architect. They aren't hired to design a building with, just do whatever you want. There's always constraints of budget, location, building codes, all kinds of constraints, customers' desires, but that doesn't mean they can't be creative. So often, if you give kids too much voice and choice without any limits, I've seen them come back to me begging for structure. So I think you also need to gradually release kids sometimes with voice and choice and not overwhelm them, because it can be paralyzing. So if you've never done PBL before, or you're new to it, your kids are, even if you're experienced and your students are new to it, giving them some freedom but some structure is a good idea for your first time with PBL. And you can always give them more freedom if they're begging for it or if they want it, and say, sure, go do that if they come up with great ideas.
Absolutely. I think the part that's the most challenging for a lot of teachers is how to make sure that within the structure of voice and choice, they're still making sure everybody learns what needs to be known. And there's part of the challenge there, of course, is the perception that we even know what kids necessarily need to know. But beyond that, here are the things that are going to be tested. If I jigsaw topics and I allow groups to focus on different topics, how do I make sure that every group knows what the other one studied as well? And the truth is that you don't know. There isn't a way necessarily to easily say everyone will have the same depth of expertise, but figuring out ways to structure opportunities for those groups to share with each other repeatedly, to rehearse for each other, and to really make sure that we hit those standards still. I think that's one of the big challenges for a lot of teachers, is figuring out how to they see the value of choice, but there's a fear that there are going to be certain things that get missed or skipped, or that kids might not make good choices. And that, obviously we still stay in the scenario, so it's not as though we stop coaching them toward good choices, but I think there is a prevailing fear they'll make bad choices, we won't hit the standards we need to.
And I think there's different ways to look at, especially the choice part. There can be choice in the content, like what she was mentioning about jigsawing, but there also can be choice in the product, or there can be choice in the assessment. Some kids may be more comfortable writing versus verbal assessment. So sometimes I mix it up in different products. In projects, I give different choices in different projects on different areas. So there's different places where you can offer choice and different places where you offer consistency in what all kids have to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Mike, that goes back to what I was saying before. What's the purpose behind the choice that teachers are providing for students? And absolutely, in elementary, a lot of the standards are written in such a way that they automatically lend themselves to a lot of choice on the student's part. So there's a science standard that has to do with learning about living and non-living things. It doesn't dictate which living things kids are looking at. So that would be a great time for kids to choose a living thing that interests them and then learn about the characteristics of living things through that study, where other standards may not be that open.
I think you're right, Kristen, and I think that by the high school level, that's where it gets really complex. I think that at least the fear gets complex by the high school level for the teacher, that there are certain non-negotiables that absolutely must be taught. And as soon as content starts to trump everything else, I think it becomes more difficult for the teacher to allow for significant choice. My own experience, certainly as a teacher, is that the more I offered choice, the better, deeper content learning I got from students very consistently. So I always saw it as worth doing. But I think there's a prevailing fear, especially at the 10th, 11th, 12th grade level, that if they don't get it from me, they're not going to get it, and I must cover certain things that everybody needs to know. And I understand the fear, even though I think we have to figure out how to move teachers past it.
All right, let's hear some examples of projects that illustrate voice and choice, and some other. If you want to offer some more best practices along the way, that's fine too. So let's hear about a project. Mike, you had one, right, from Grand Rapids?
Sure. I'm going to share. I'll share two things. The first one is just going to be just kind of a quick picture of a project we did on women's rights. So we looked at the whole history of women's rights and also some gender issues. And our students then prepared art pieces, and these are presented at a community art festival called Art Prize in Grand Rapids. It's actually the biggest art festival for prize money, I think, in the world, if not at least the country, with like $500,000 of total prizes. So the kids are really excited to present there, and you can see they did all different things, including on the whiteboard there, pottery pieces, ceramic pieces, and fabric. And
Mike, we're not seeing your screen yet. Are you sharing your screen?
Oh, I thought it was. Sorry.
I didn't quite get it. It takes a minute sometimes to pop up.
I forgot to hit one thing.
Oh, here we go.
There we go.
All right, so back up. So what are we seeing?
So you can see the whiteboard that says 1 through 21 on it are all ceramic pieces, and there's some fabric pieces, and then there's some photography pieces, all done on different themes of women's rights. So different products are all art related, but art, I find, as a social studies teacher, is always a good product where kids really have the chance to express their learning and what ways matter to them. And then one of the ones I'll quickly share is the election project that we did and are going to do again this year in the fall, is having students create their own political parties. And in this one, it gives kids really the voice part, which I think sometimes teachers forget about, and that we want students not just to choose about their learning, but we want their learning to matter. And so in this one, they create their own political party with their own platform, make a 30-second commercial, and we have a primary at our school, and we run off and get a winner, and then they compete against other schools. And I think the valuable part about this is students learn that a lot of kids say, oh, I don't care about politics. And then they get into the project and they start looking at issues, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, they do care. And that's where the voice comes in, and they start getting interested in being a citizen, which I think in our democratic society is a really important part of it. So giving students a voice, we shouldn't forget that part out, and it's not just the same as choice.
Okay, good point. Voice and choice are separate things. They're lumped together in our model's language, but they really are. You need to pay attention to both. Just giving students choice of creating a product doesn't mean they're having a voice in how the project goes or their own voice is coming out through the product. Okay, and Jennifer, you had a project which addresses a common thing we've noticed, and I was a former high school English teacher myself, tied to the literature, the canon. How do you do project-based learning with a piece of literature? So you've got a good example for that one.
I do, the example I'm going to share is a Lord of the Flies PBL, which honestly was a little different every year I ran it. Over the years I learned a lot about what worked and didn't work. But I agree, John, I think there's a real challenge for a lot of literary teachers or literature teachers to try to figure out how to make something really student-centered and create that voice and choice. So one of the things that I did in my own 9th grade English classroom was connected to the novel Lord of the Flies. And anybody who's read the book or studied the book knows that the author's intent really was to make a commentary on World War II and on the experiences that he'd had as a soldier and what his views of global politics were. So what I came up with was this idea, and I'm glad to share a link at the end to the resources if anybody'd like to take a look at these and make use of them. The driving question was, how can we as sociologists use Lord of the Flies to understand and solve a modern day conflict in the world? So we were doing the traditional literary analysis, of course, that a Lord of the Flies class would always contain, but with that very specific eye to the intentions of the author. What were the things that he was trying to point out about the nature of war and conflict, and then how could those how could his points be incorporated into the solutions to a modern problem? And this goes back to what Mike was saying about voice, because I agree, I think there is a distinction. And so this project was designed, first of all, to give them choice of conflict. They could choose any argument that they wanted to craft. They needed to have an understanding of World War II, of the novel, and then be able to apply this understanding to a modern conflict. They needed to know enough about that conflict, too, to be able to really write an effective piece of persuasive writing, which was then sent to the stakeholder of their choice. So I actually had kids, for example, sending their final pieces of writing to Netanyahu, for example, focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian project, or conflict, pardon me. I had students identifying key players in city politics and gangs versus police brutality kinds of issues. So it was a combination of getting to choose how you wanted to apply the learning, and then also really trying to create that sense of voice for the kids as well, so that they really felt like what they were creating was getting out there. And I can't say that we got a ton of replies, but we certainly knew that we had really put these ideas into the hands of the people who needed to see them. And so it was a very powerful and empowering project. And it was interesting trying to teach Lord of the Flies to an all-girls high school in an all-girls setting. For 11 years of my career, most people thought I was clinically insane to even be trying. But what I found was that girls really wanted to take William Golding's message and turn it into something constructive, because the end of the novel was just too depressing for them, and they really wanted to be able to do something with what they learned from it. So this really helped the engagement. And the literary analysis was amazing as well.
All right, I like that. Connecting literature to present day events, and the themes in it, and I think that's a great way for teachers to approach literature and project-based learning.
Well, and John, if I may, in my literature class for 7th grade, we had to read a book called Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy, and it's a coming-of-age novel. So it's a young man who moves from Boston to Maine, and because he doesn't know all the unwritten rules of the area of Maine, he has a really tough time fitting in, even though he was somebody who everybody looked up to back in Boston. So before we started the novel, the driving question was, how do I survive middle school without losing myself? And I had students get into small groups, and they created lists of what are the rules that we have to follow in middle school, and then what are the unwritten rules. And it was that second question that really generated a lot of discussion. And the purpose behind that was, as we were reading the story about this young man trying to transition from one place to another, how it was really the unwritten rules that guided what people did. And through that, looking at the story in that lens, we ended up having just a lot of really rich discussions about middle school and how difficult it can be to balance that tension between who am I as an individual, but yet who am I within the group. And even though kids want to be known as individuals, they don't want to stand out. Eventually what they ended up creating, because our school was a 7-8 school, they created a survivor's guide to middle school for the incoming 6th graders, and within that they were able to just bring their voice to what was their experience in middle school, what did they learn as a result of trying to walk this tense line between who am I and who am I as far as the group goes. And it was amazing. It happened to be a year where I had like 26 really rough 7th grade boys and then 6 girls. And those boys really hated reading, but because we were reading a story that was pretty complex, but using it to analyze our own experience as middle schoolers, it ended up working really well. So that was, again, a way, there wasn't a lot of choice in the work, but there was definitely a lot of voice, and I think it seemed to translate well for that group of kids.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, sorry, somebody else want to jump in there?
Yeah, can I share one other example, John? I have a colleague who teaches chemistry, and in his class, they do a lot of experiments, but they're never canned ones. So he will give them the concept and talk about with the driving question, like why don't oil and water mix or something like that. And then the students go look often on YouTube and do research and find experiments that then they want to attempt and do, and then they modify them. So they get really excited in his class because they don't know the answer to the experiments since they're not canned. They all are doing their own experiments, different experiments, and then the learning comes back to the whole group. They're hitting the standards, but they all get to pick kind of where they're going to attack it and how they're going to see it from a science point of view.
All right, I like that example. Yeah, if you guys want to toss in examples from other subject areas and grade levels, that'd be great. Let's also talk about some of the pitfalls and challenges typical when teachers try and introduce voice and choice in project-based learning. And Jennifer, you mentioned one earlier, giving students too much choice or not having parameters or constraints on their choices sometimes. So too much choice can definitely be a pitfall or a challenge. And so what else have you seen, or what else do you recommend that teachers pay attention to when they're thinking about voice and choice?
Well, I'll say I think a lot of it has to do with depends on whether what you're looking for is to cultivate kids really thinking for themselves. I think one of the pitfalls that teachers often fall back on is I'm going to give them a limited list, right? And I'm going to provide this limited list on the board, and that's going to get us where we need to go, because I know that these products or these topics would be viable. My fear is that even that on a lot of levels suggests to the kids that there's only one set of potential answers, and that allowing kids to be part of brainstorming that limited list would be useful. Right? In other words, even when we think we're offering choice, if it's our 5 choices, is that still more teacher-directed than it needs to be?
Oh, I like that. So involving students in setting the limits or in deciding what the constraints are.
Yep, exactly. Very much like Kristen's example of the guide to surviving middle school, right? That idea being that I, as the teacher, can still cultivate a really good final list, but that it really starts from the kids more than it's starting from my, coming up and saying, here are the things that are, here are your options. Because there's always going to be that divergent thinker in the class, which is the kid for whom this is the most important element. That divergent thinker is going to immediately see 15 options we didn't put on the board unless we involve that kid in the conversation.
Sometimes, going off from that, I like to give kids things they can't do. So sometimes we still have to have them present in class as like a second product and with the PBL unit. And so what I'll tell them is you can't do a presentation, you can't do slides, anything but that. Or I've also told them part of how I'm grading you is if kids are on their cell phone while you're presenting, they're bored, you're going to lose points. You should be interesting enough that kids don't want to wander off and do other things in their mind. So putting some fun things like that on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. No more death by PowerPoint presentations, right? All right. Kristen, you had some thoughts?
Well, Mike made a comment earlier about when teachers are new in their journey into project-based learning, the importance of scaffolding for students. Because to go from a completely teacher-directed experience to a student-directed or facilitated experience without any transition can be really overwhelming for kids. I think about my grandson, who went from a traditional second grade and then he entered a Montessori school, and there was no help to help him understand the routines and the ways that that was going to look for him. And he was miserable for the first 6 weeks of school because he just didn't understand. And I think that is a common pitfall, right? Teachers will go to the 101 training, they'll go back to their classrooms, and it's like suddenly the switch got flipped and everything changes, and the kids don't know how to do it, and the teacher doesn't understand why they don't understand it. So to really be sure that there's a built-in transition to whatever degree, and often in my class, what I'll do is, when I'm not doing a project, I'm trying to incorporate as many of those elements as I possibly can, even within the regular teaching that I do. So I might, if it's just a regular assignment, I might give the kids the opportunity to use a tech tool to show your understanding of X. So there's some choice there. I'm not doing a project, but I am helping them bridge that idea that the teacher's not always going to tell me how to show proficiency. I, as a student, have some input as to what that's going to look like before I just open it up for them, because I think otherwise they can sit and stare and not know exactly even where to start.
Yeah, that's a good point. It sort of gets at the idea of how you build a culture for project-based learning, which is another one of our gold standard project-based teaching practices, build the culture. And we talk a lot, we're talking more and more, I should say, about how teachers can build the culture for PBL before they launch the first project, or in between projects. You can still do a lot of things in your classroom that will prepare students for project-based learning. So you gave some good examples there, giving them voice and choice, for just certain kinds of assignments or certain routines in the classroom. Lots of ways you can give students voice and choice. It's not actually part of a project per se.
Yeah, and I think to dovetail off of that, I think that the word routines is really key, because I know that for a lot of teachers, when they stuck their heads into my classroom, it looked like just total chaos reigned, and it definitely looked that way on the surface. But this also ties into that piece of assessment, which I know is really challenging for a lot of teachers. I think that's one of the things that holds a lot of teachers back from full choice, is the fear over how the heck do I assess 15 different kinds of products around the same topic, or 15 different topics around the same product. It feels unmanageable. And I think those classroom routines, my students knew when it was work time, the first thing they did was grab their task logs, made a plan for the work time, and by the end of work time, they knew that their responsibility was to report on what had been accomplished and what still needed to be accomplished. And so there were certain things that we built into the culture of the classroom that made all of that choice very manageable from my perspective when it came to assessment and things like that. So having those routines in place, having systems in place that allow students to know how to manage themselves and learn how to manage themselves, and then also to be able to hold them accountable for their learning as well.
Yeah, that what you just said reminded me about formative assessment is another way to provide voice and choice. And one of the routines in the classroom might be, here's how we give critique and give each other feedback. That's a chance for students to have, to have voice there too, to share ideas with their peers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another thing with voice and choice is giving students an opportunity to reflect on the projects in the class itself and which can be scary, but we like to do I likes and I wonders at the end of the project on the project itself. And we get a lot of good feedback on what students like or don't like about the project, and then we adjust that on future projects. And it's important to actually listen, or the students will see, they're going to kind of call BS on you and say, well, you say you want to listen to us, but then you don't change anything. So really give them a voice and choice in how the whole class runs is part of that culture building, and that's when students really are going to take ownership of the class and do some pretty incredible things.
And one last thought on that related to what Mike was just saying. Consider at the beginning of the year finding out what interests your kids. You give them an interest inventory. That makes it easier to provide choices that maybe will resonate with the kids, so that you're connecting again with who they are as individuals and possibly tapping into that resource for guiding the work.
Okay, great tip, Kristen. Yeah, Mike, excellent point about if students raise their voice, if you give them voice, you've got to listen to it. That's a good quote there. Okay. Because you're right, they will call BS on you if you don't. And I like the point also, but the whole project itself needs to hear their voice too, and reflecting at the end is an important place to gather that voice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the clock on the screen says 12:30. It's about time to wrap up. And let me just, I'll ask our guests for a final thought in a second. Just want to remind viewers out there, this is being archived and being recorded, and it'll be archived at bie.org. And I'll be writing a blog about it for next week and posting a summary of this hangout with our guests. So before I wrap up, let's hear a final thought or anything else you guys want to say?
I would just say, if it comes to student voice and choice, go for it. If you're the kind of teacher who worries about losing control, you're not going to lose control of everything. Take that leap, take a risk, and the reward will pay off because you will see students do things that they will never do in the classroom you're controlling.
And I would say by providing voice and choice, you may find that that child who is totally disconnected in class may suddenly wake up and surprise you.
Absolutely, and I'll come back to what I said at the beginning. I think that voice and choice is at the heart of helping to foster in young people the ability to come up with new solutions to the world's problems. We don't need more repetition of what's been done in the past. We need something unique and different and new. Things like what Boyan Slat has come up with. He's a great closing image, I think, for me anyway, of he's the young Dutchman who at 20 is now piloting and prototyping the first garbage cleanup for the gyres, for the plastic in the gyres. And that's a project that he came up with because he was snorkeling in Greece and noticed that there was more plastic than there were sea creatures. So his passion has now led him to what we expect will probably be a lifetime of doing ocean cleanup, and that comes from his passion and sense of purpose. So creating space in classrooms and schools for that to be born and for that to be that independent thinking to be fostered, I think is really key.
All right, hear, hear. Thanks. All right, guys, great comments. Thank you very much for joining us today. So for everybody out there, we'll be doing another hangout in 2 weeks on April 5th on the topic of Engage and Coach. It's one of our project-based teaching practices, so with more of our national faculty as guests. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.